Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
Oh my god, there is another voice here.
And this is all because this is a new episode of Biweeklycast, and this is an episode where we talk to guests, and our guest today is Vasya.
Yeah, hello. Nice to meet you guys.
Thank you for coming. I think I should tell a few words about you, and then you could add something if you feel that people should know something about you. Vasyl Zadvorny is one of the brightest public managers that I know, and I've met him when he was on the position of CEO at ProZorro. Previously, he had experience with software development as a PMO manager, and right now he's working back in normal business as a product lead. Vasyl, what should people know about you?
Well, first of all, I think you met two less public managers, if you called me like the one of the brightest one. So I get there are still a lot of bright person, at least in Ukrainian public management. But I mean, all the rest is pretty close to the reality. So yeah, I was working. So I mean, I need to add that I worked like 6 years on a public area, leading the ProZorro company, which is basically I need to tell a bit more, which is basically was responsible for managing and developing the public procurement system in Ukraine, which is also called ProZorro. And for those who are not knowing Ukrainian well, ProZorro means transparent from Ukrainian. So the public procurement system was made just after a revolution of dignity in order to provide like the transparency to the public procurement, and I mean like well recognized all over the globe as one of the successful reform. And I mean then after the 6 years I decided that I spent a lot of time helping the states, so probably I need to have some kind of recap in normal business. But everything else is pretty okay.
And interestingly enough, ProZorro is considered to be one of the best cases of automation of state services in ever. And today we are going to tackle the belief in Ukrainian IT and not just IT business that the state services and functions should be as automated as possible to minimize the corruption, to make it more effective, and just to go to the future. Let's start remembering how we landed on this topic, like what was interesting and why we would like to discuss it in the first place. Anybody?
Well, basically, from my perspective, the topic is interesting because there is I would say, like from my perspective, there is a kind of myth that like all the government can be substituted with like one or two scripts, and like 100 software developments can substitute all the government structures. And because of my like career, I was used to think about the government in the same pattern. So I was thinking that all the government structure, it's something from the 19th century, I don't know, where you need just to give a job to amount of people, and you just invented all these papers which they need to create and to sign. And that's absolutely ridiculous and doesn't make any sense. But because I worked like 6 years in the government, I pretty changed my mind, and probably that would be interesting to discuss, like the pros and cons and real possibility of automation of the government, and some of constraints which are definitely there, and why, at least from my perspective, you could not substitute the government with the tech. On a 100%. So definitely you can reduce the number of civil servants, but that doesn't mean you will like just fire all of them.
That's interesting because I think that it's kind of related to this populistic mention that there could be state in a smartphone, that basically the country functions could all fit into a number of apps and you could interact with your country or your state, your government, and the public services just using some services. And it seems like a trend that digitalization is supposedly killing bureaucracy, that digital services should do that. I can see it, for example, in the banking industry. Privatbank and then Monobank in Ukraine started a tendency when people got used that you don't have to bring your passport to the bank because they know you, they can verify who you are just technologically. And then things like Dia happened to Ukrainian life, and it also brought in some changes that you don't actually have to bring the driving license with you, or you don't need to prove your identity anymore with any paperback documents. Maybe you have to in many cases, but like in some occasions you don't. And how quickly such things become a norm that people expect that it should work like this everywhere now. Like there is one bank that can verify your identity, so every bank should do that within 6 months. If they don't, they're old school, and I don't want to work with them anymore.
Well, 2 comments from my side. First of all, with regards to the state in the smartphone, I guess it appears in Ukraine in somewhere 1994 when the first mobile station was introduced by Kuchma at that time. And from that time, you can just call someone by phone and resolve all your issues with the corruption. So from that perspective, you already have a state in smartphone, and there's no problem with that. But beside of jokes, the interesting point of view here is again that basically technology in these cases, they do not kill the state. They just provide you another type and another channel of interaction. And basically, DIA is here as a great example. So yes, you do not need to have your driving license with you, but you have to have the phone instead, basically. So it's probably much more convenient and comfortable to have phone because there are a lot of stuff in the phone. But from this perspective, it's not like the changing of the way how the government interacts with the citizen. Still the government provides the license to those who want to drive on the territory of this state, but just in another way. And when we are talking about automation, it's really important to differ these 2 types of automation. So automating and providing more convenient and comfortable way to do the regular stuff, instead of just deleting some stuff from the interaction between the government and the citizen. And in most cases, we will be talking only about this first part. So just make the things much more comfortable. And yes, Ukraine here is a great example. Probably that's because Ukraine started a bit after all other countries. So we do not have this legacy system. That's an example of development of cell networks in Africa. So there are almost no, as far as I know, PBX phones, but there are a lot of mobile networks just because they started and they do not have these competencies with the regular network. So, how it was in Ukraine, for example, example of ProZorro is so great because, ProZorro was started as a system, as an IT product in late 2014. That means that ProZorro already got these advantages of non-relative databases and Amazon Web Services as the infrastructure platform, and new programming languages which might be used for the development, and so on and so forth. And a lot of, for example, European public procurement system instead, they were development in the early 2000s. So it was kind of, C#, ASP.NET or something like that, Oracle database, big relative system as a database, and that's it. That's give huge momentum for Ukraine, and that provides us an opportunity to, deliver better services. But again, it's all about better services which automate existing process. It's not so much example where you can just substitute the governmental services itself with the technology.
Right. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think that this whole notion of how do we call it, state in a smartphone is quite a bit misleading, right? And like as software, as most of us have some relation to software, and we know that there are two most difficult problems or challenges in software engineering is naming things and cache invalidation. And like naming things would be an example here, right? Because when we call it a state in a smartphone, it's a misnomer, right? What we are talking about is easier access to a particular subset of state services or services provided by the state, and only in subset as it relates to interaction of an individual and the state. A lot of other stuff like interaction of businesses or industries with the state would not be covered with that. And yeah, I often appreciate when people use more precise names for their products and their things. It does help a lot. And yeah, I totally agree with the point that the starting, like when we are talking about automation anywhere, like starting point does matter a lot. If there are multiple examples of that, like for example in China, when China seems to be ahead of the rest of the world in terms of like mobile payments with the smartphone applications and stuff like that, and the market share of credit card payment there is very low. But that's because they kind of skip the credit card phase altogether, and the rest of the world has lots of investment in like credit card payment infrastructure, which makes it difficult to move to the next stage.
Yeah, I mean, you remind me an example of these credit card payments. One day I was trying to lease a car in Italy, and they didn't accept my card because they only require like the credit one with the ambassador number, because they use this, like old-fashioned machine to have a stamp. Yeah, and so I cannot just lease a car because all my cards were without this embassy. And but basically, just going back to the state automation, in case of Ukraine, I also might think that the reason for this naming state in a smartphone might also be connected to to the Ukrainians' perception of the government. And that's again basically the big problem. We need to remember that like almost 300 years, all the government that governs Ukrainian people was somehow like the government of the conqueror. So either from the Russian Empire or from the USSR or from, Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. That means that in Ukrainian culture, you used to perceive the government as something, as like an enemy, as an alien in your territory. And probably that's why the idea is that we will substitute the government, or we will substitute the government with the technology, means basically we will get rid of these enemies who try to govern us. And that's why probably the naming in Ukraine works so well. But that definitely doesn't mean you need to try, definitely substitute the government. You need to substitute like these enemies in the government with your enemy, like getting ownership of it rather than getting rid of it. And basically continuing these thoughts with this regard, like the technology can also help to like increase this citizens' engagement. So when we are talking about like getting ownership on the government, it basically means that citizens get a like power of control, and the control begins with the transparency and information. And probably when we are talking about like moving of state automation, we might think a bit about this area. To provide more information so people can feel that they have ownership on the government. But that in turn means that this Ukrainian case cannot be probably such successfully implemented in all other countries without the similar historical context. So there's a big difference in this area as well.
No, I think one thing we could add in here that I think that Ukrainian society in overall is kind of allergic to high-level corruption. They tolerate lower-level corruption when they can buy the driving license or do something on the minor steps, but whenever there is a piece of news about some judgmental corruption or state-level corruption or ministry-level corruption, it feels super unfair. And I believe that whenever we were mostly talking about this notion in the context of Ukrainian tech business, that Ukrainian tech managers, they believe that that's a good solution. And I think that this DIA City initiative about another legal jurisdiction that was supposedly saving our businesses from any corruption seems like an illusion, like something that could potentially resolve something else by introducing new services and by introducing technology somewhere where it hasn't been before. And that's interesting why this belief actually happened, because basically ProZorro was the only thing, and maybe DIA slightly, but mostly ProZorro, was the reform that reduced the corruption significantly. I also like this reform of state service centers. I'm not sure what they are for the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where you can get the passport and stuff with higher transparency rates. But transparency isn't equal automation to me. I think that transparency could be done in many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that brings us to the starting point. So the technology is only the way to get the real value with more convenience or less cost. So yeah, definitely you can provide the transparency without the technology, but with the technology it would be easier and it would be probably a bit more reliable and more convenient and so on. And basically, as we are talking about the corruption, so again, the idea of the fighting with the corruption probably contains with the several parts. So first of all, the transparency is the great tool to reduce the corruption, because you just can provide more information. So everyone can see everything and control might increase. But another way how to use the technology in order to reduce the corruption, you can just automate some part of the process. And here probably automation might work really well. And basically the decision will be taken by the algorithm, not by the person. And that's mean there would...
Can you think of 2 or 3 examples where it could work right now?
For example, like in a public procurement. So you are sending the bids through the system, and these bids are being stored in a secure place in the database. And that means no one can know who basically sent the bid before the bids would be open. And since you don't know who really sent the bids, you cannot go call by phone for your competitors and try to have some kind of
unfair advantage.
Unfair advantages or just have a conclusion with them. You give us this tender, we give you that tender, and so on. So that's one of the way. And another way is when the cases, for example, are being distributed on an automatically basis between the judges. So you cannot understand who will basically have your cases. Definitely, the people will try to find a way how to skip these algorithms. But in vast majority cases, it might work. Another example from for example, like this declaration of civil servants in Ukraine. So all civil servants are obligated to put their annual declaration in the system, and then it's just an algorithm who uses specific risk indicators and who choose the declaration which should be then checked by the detective. It's not the person who just picking up the declaration by themselves. So these small parts where the solution of specific person might really lead to some corrective action, they definitely can be automated. But that doesn't mean that you get rid of like procurement itself, or that you get rid of detective itself. At least not I think in the nearest 10 years. Probably like later, artificial intelligence will do some job. But
maybe it is doing now, but we don't know about it.
Well, sometimes when you are in the meetings with the civil servants, you think that, artificial intelligence, here it is.
Because you never know whether the judge is actually advising this chat GPT there and asking like,
But you can figure
there.
You can probably you would be able to figure this out. Like, speaking of ChatGPT, I think that there are already services that would, like, you feed the text and it would determine, or at least try to determine with a certain degree of confidence whether it was produced by like artificial or a large language model versus a human. What I wanted to say here, I think, Slava, you alluded to this point that the in fighting corruption, kind of transparency would play a lot greater role than automation or something like this. And we often the way I think about technology typically would be that technology can amplify like whatever values that we put into the processes and into the systems, and those values the values play the key role there, because even just adding automation to the bad process, it means that we're just doing bad things more efficiently. The process itself, what they kind of the system, the setup has to be improved first before it can be then amplified through automation. And I think it often can be sort of a pitfall that or trap that people kind of fall into, where they see the successful example of how the technology or automation was applied to solve a particular problem. They often, like, the technology itself would be the most visible part of it, and they think, oh, that's the technology that solved it, and then they think, oh, we apply technology here and it will be better, like that joke in engineering circles, like everything is better with Bluetooth. not really, not really. And then like what is often missed is that there was a thought into how to drive the process or the system or the organization in one particular direction, and then apply technology or automation to help everything move in that direction.
That's basically the great thought. Well, I mean, first of all, definitely like an automation of chores. I mean, only leads to automated chores. So I mean, you without like engineering of business processes, you cannot do anything. And again, like the engineering of the processes is not about like getting rid of the government, but it's about the changing of way on how we just interact with each other. But even more interesting part here is about basically product management. So it's about an implementation. So another probably myth about the technology, especially about the technology in the government, would be so we saw the great example of some technology somewhere outside, or we will develop the greatest tool by ourselves. We'll, just develop it, install, deploy, and everything would fine. But come on, it's only like 10-20% of work. So the mostly part of the work begin after the implementation. And in case of state services, you need to ensure that all the people who are supposed to use these services will use them in the way you were expecting them to use them. And that's like a huge part of work. I mean, just imagine, like, Ukraine is really huge country, like 30-40 million of people. Like even in ProZorro, we did have like 200,000 of suppliers who interact with the state, and like 30,000 of public procuring entity. And it's all like the typical user. They do not know how to use the system. They need support, and that's a great deal. So, and again, when we're talking about substituting the government with the technology, even if you will find some type of process which might be fully automated, and you will implement the software, you still need to implement like a huge amount of people who will support this, like the software and support the process. Because without that, you just wouldn't use the system, and that's it. Basically, one of the like funny example of that might be like the service of creating this sole partnership, or how does it called, like sole-owned company, which is used by the most developers in Ukraine.
Individual enterprise.
How to call it in
something.
yeah, like individual enterprises or so. Yeah. So basically, like 1 or 2 years ago, this service was implemented in Dia, so you can just use the Dia in order to create these individual enterprises. But the funny part of this story is it's basically not the Dia service. It's a service of taxation, state tax services, and they basically provide these services like 5 years ago in their cabinet. But their cabinet looks so awful that only a small part of the people used to use them, and that basically does not mean that everyone used to use these services. That's why just after Dia provide a great interface for that, everyone say, oh yeah, now we have a service. And that's an example of, you have not only to create something, you need also to engage the people and to collaborate with them. And that's also the great part of.
And most of our examples are quite casual, and they are, let's say, peacetime services. Yeah, something that works when everything is fine. And in this article that we haven't mentioned, I guess, yet, is the Institute for State Effectiveness. There is a description of 10 functions of the state, and some of them I find quite interesting and hard to automate. When you think of such things as security or infrastructure, these are huge projects, and no matter how much I love libertarian system and their philosophy, I find it hard to believe that in the nearest 50 years we would be able to manage infrastructure as individual enterprises on total markets, especially right now in Ukraine, like now when situation has escalated seriously. And with an example of Turkey and the earthquake, the disaster resilience, I'm not sure that an open market would be able to effectively manage such thing. And therefore, if, let's say, some disaster reaction things were automated, would the algorithm be able to handle an emergency in such situation?
Definitely. Well, if we're going back to the roots, so one of probably the first function of state is the providing security, and basically it's about armed forces. And even comparing the amount of money which were donated by citizens with the amount of money which were donated by states shows that all the citizen donation is no more than 5% or so out of all military budget. So it's a state who should pay for the military service, and you saw how difficult it was to buy even something like close to weapon by the private companies. And if we're talking about shipment of weapon, it's almost impossible in modern world. So it doesn't sound really close to logical. Just get rid of taxation and let the people will buy the weapon and so. And again, with regards to the infrastructure as well, so there are a huge amount of money and the process which should be spent. But another interesting part of this story is that basically government, like the politics, again, getting back to the roots to the ancient Greeks, it's more about alignment of interests of the huge amount of stakeholders. And that's mean that, probably you can substitute the government with some platform where all the interests of all the stakeholders would be balanced. But that simply means that this platform will become the government. So we can look on the government as on the tool which allows us to balance all the interests of different parts of the stakeholders, like this great bill in Great Britain, like when the barons get the rights to collaborate with the king. So the idea is that always in the society there are like the vast majority of different groups, and these groups have their interests. They need to balance these interests, and the government is a tool which allows you to balance this interest in the current moment in the most effective way. And that's not about technology. That's about how people will balance their interests. And all this like bureaucracy and the parliaments and the tools and all this structure which we invented as a humanity, they just simply help us to balance this interest in order to save the society. And I mean, from that perspective, it would be really difficult to substitute this function. And another interesting point on looking on the government from this perspective is that it's pretty clear what is the difference between the commercial product and the governmental IT services from this perspective. So, I mean, again, in the government, in the most cases, you will have like all your citizens as your stakeholders, even if not as your users, but as a stakeholders for sure. And on another way, on the government side, you cannot choose some market share for your product. You need to serve all your users from the very beginning. So, I mean, in case of public procurement, you cannot create the public. So, I mean, you can, but it would be really hard and almost certain will fail. You cannot create the public procurement only for, I don't know, several state-owned enterprises like the mining industry, and which will work only with the suppliers from the key regions. No, you need to create the platform which would be used by all the country from one or another. And as well as India, you cannot create a service with the driver license only for the, I mean, Kiev citizens.
Well, technically you can, but should you?
Technically you can, but on a political level, it would be banned, I mean, almost certainly. Mm-hmm. And that's in turn mean that you from the very beginning have some kind of different marketing perspective on the government level and on the commercial level. So you cannot like narrow the focus. You still need to serve everyone. And you need to understand all the interests of all the groups, and that make it quite more difficult to develop.
Fair enough. It actually brings me to an idea that sometimes when I think about citizen engagement, when you want to get all the people on board and make them use the apps and make them vote on the polls and somehow participate in the government life or state life, these days I have a feeling that government is getting into the business area right now. Like when Dia and some Kyiv Цифровой app and some others, they're trying to use marketing tools, like all these pop-up notifications and ads and stuff to engage people in. And I feel kind of weird about this tendency because it seems that we are building something that we might lose control of completely. And as an example, I can think of this Chinese social ranking system. Something like that. And that's an example where you give away some sort of, ethical decisions to algorithms and people. And Dima, have you heard of this Chinese experiment? Yeah,
right.
That they could rank each other
It's running, I think. The last time I heard, right, that their government uses this to kind of control and to a certain degree oppress the population there, right?
And basically understanding the tendency in the psychology that, let's say, people don't trust each other, they will have a tendency to put some lower ranks, and that could initially decrease the overall credit and the use of some public services as well, just because people don't like each other or because it's like a mental cap. And that brings me to the question about people who create these algorithms and the fairness of them, because you can create them as a great idea. Like, let's imagine you do something nice and people upvote you and you become a superstar and you get more possibilities and you get an opportunity to get to a better university or to travel more or to do some things. And then it faces the reality of our world when there is populism, there are some unfair methods of managing these public opinions, and voila, it becomes a really risky, dangerous thing and even if something unfair happens, there is no way to reverse it, or there is no tool to counterbalance such a thing.
Yep, totally. I think like with automation is like many things are all algorithms are double-edged sword, right? When as soon as you draw the line, you immediately get two sides of that line. And on one hand, with automation algorithms, you may perceive that you're getting efficiency in something, like being able to, like with that social ranking kind of thing, like to being able to quickly kind of identify people who are not reliable or maybe have malicious intent and like be wary of them and then not provide services to them or something like that, which can be like scammy sellers on platforms or stuff like that. It's useful to identify that, but then immediately that there is another sword, and another side of the sword is like, what if the algorithm makes mistakes, just genuine mistake, like a typo happens somewhere and all of a sudden you get like 0 or like 1 star. Like is there even a recourse from that? Like you not only should have an algorithm that calculates and assigns stars, it immediately must be complemented with the methods and procedures for correcting mistakes there. And also like that also opens a possibility for someone to play the system, right? To manipulate your ranking such that you get it lower because of gaps in algorithm and so on and so forth. And that reminds me of an example that we discussed very recently about what was it, like the fitness app with the streak functionality, where like this is an algorithm which is designed to motivate you to keep going on your things, but when it breaks, it can break for such a benign reason, but that algorithm can amplify the negative effect of that for you, right? If you accidentally broke your streak and it says that, hey, you were exercising for 350 days and now you're back to square one. It's just one day streak. So I think the algorithms immediately introduce that problem, that there is a good side of algorithm and the bad side of algorithm, and we have to account for both and plan for dealing with them. It cannot be just algorithm is an answer to everything. It just is an answer to something that also introduce a whole new host of challenges that we may need to deal with.
Yeah, two thoughts over here. First of all, when we're talking about algorithms, I guess we're also talking about the trust itself. The good example here might be from the discussion of using the digital technology to automate the election system. And I guess from one, of course, from Coursera, which was prepared by the US election in 2021. I guess it was the election in 2021 or 2020 in US. It was said that the problem of the technology in election is not to like derive the solved, is to be sure that the side which we will lose the election, and there is always someone who loses the election, they will trust the result. That is basically the problem. So, I mean, definitely the part who will win, they will trust the result of the election. But the part who will lose, they need to have a system which they will trust too. And it's much more difficult to provide such type of trust to the technology, not to the paper. You can count the paper ballots by yourself if you'd like to. But how would you count the ballots on the digital system? And so when we're talking about again going back to substituting the government with the technology, it's also a bit about the trust. So, I mean, if there is a person who take a wrong decision, I mean, you can take this person into the court, but what would you do with the algorithm? So how would you perform this? Yeah, there was a second thought, but I forgot it.
Welcome to the club. Dima does that all the time.
Happens to me all the time. It's very interesting that you should bring this topic of elections and so on and so forth. And trust indeed is an important aspect of that. But what if there is no system possible that would allow for that trust? And here I would plug in, speaking of referencing the research and like scientific results, there is a thing called Arrow's impossibility theorem, which by and large states that like and proves that it is impossible to have a fair election system. So if we are holding an election with, I think it says 3 or more alternatives, there is basically no way to convert like voting preferences of individual voters into something that would be fair, but by every possible measure as a representation of the entire population. I'm both like, as with all scientific research, like my reciting it now butchers the idea, but I would very much encourage everyone to go check it out. It's very, very interesting. It's kind of says that it's just not mathematically not possible to have a fair election system.
Well, I guess it has some to do with the definition of fairness, first of all. So what does mean by fairness, first of all? And second of all, I mean, my graduation in Kyiv Polytechnical Institute was the networks and communication. That's why I'll also look on this as on the losers of signal while transferring them in a medium. So if you do have a lot of signals which are being transferred from the citizens to some kind of center of decision through somehow medium, then definitely some of the signal would be lost and some of the signal would be misinterpreted on the other side of this media. So probably that's have to deal something with that. On another hand, do we need really 100% fair system in this case? Or we need just the state which be a bit more effective than it was yesterday? So probably it's not like the idea of Holy Grail, but like the idea to be constantly improving. And basically, I remember my second thought. So and that's also have to deal something with the technologies. So probably our interpreting of the technology implementation and usage in the government have also deal something with our like being technologically optimistic or pessimistic. So that's also somehow connected with our perception of the way how the history is being developed. So basically, there are two different approaches over here. You can think about like constant development from today's to the greatest future, and in these cases, you might more probably be like an optimistic with the usage of technology, and you also can think about some type of past golden age where you would like to return. And in these cases, probably you'll be much more technological pessimistic because, I mean, it was in the past where there were no technology and like we should make ourselves great again, whatever we are, basically. And looking from that perspective, I guess there also would be different approaches in different countries on how the technology would be implemented on the government side. For example, in Ukraine, I think that it's pretty easy to implement technology, and Ukrainians, as far as I know from the researchers, they are much more technologically optimistic in comparison to, for example, Americans and some European countries. And some researchers connected with our past. I mean, so the beginning of the 20th century in Ukraine was absolutely awful. So it was almost close in terms of like living to the, 17th century with a huge repression and a lot of wars. And then things getting better and better and better. So it's a huge, it's really low base you are starting from. So that's mean probably tomorrow would be better than yesterday. That's why probably Ukrainians are pretty okay with the usage of technology in comparison to another one.
I would suggest the third term here. Why don't we aim at something as technology realistic? Because currently Ukrainian authorities who advocate such things like DIA, they are tech optimistic. But then it kind of makes them think that, for example, cybersecurity problems don't exist. Because the way I see it right now, we kind of hope that nothing bad happens with the algorithms and solution that we create. But realistically speaking, there are hackers, there are multiple ways to play the system. And basically, the more powerful the system is, the more options and the more ways to approach there are.
Right. And I think, I often in discussions like this, I often say, let's take a step back and think about what is the real problem that we are trying to solve here. Especially when people in engineering discussions they start we must use this particular database, or we must use this particular technology because otherwise the world will burn in ruins and stuff like that. And what's the real problem that we are trying to solve? Is the database or something other, the technology in this case is just a means to an end, right? It's not the goal that we must use technology. We think that the technology would be a good way of solving a particular problem, but then let's first focus on what the problem is and check if the technology indeed is the best way to solve it, because we might be surprised that for some problems technology may be not the best or the most effective or the easiest or the kind of cost effective way of solving things.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. So asking the question about the real problem is probably one of the greatest problem in implementing something on the government state, on the government level. And there are one more interesting insight from my works in the government sector. So in contrast with the commercial sector, in the government, you will always have a lot of customers who told you about their problems. So in commercial sector, you need to conduct a comprehensive researches. You need to, get a lot of data in order to understand what is really customer problem. Because if you wouldn't understand, they just won't buy and you'll lose money. On the government side, it works in completely different way. So, because you are almost always kind of monopolist, for example, as a ProZorro, you cannot sell something to the government without participating in the public procurement. So it's only way to deal with the government. That's why there would be a lot of people, and because you are in the position with some state stars, there would be definitely tons of customers who came to you and will told you about your problem. And the issue here is not to understand what are the problem, but to define the real root causes from that area, because it's really simple. If you do have 100 mails with a definition of a problem, the most simple way is just to choose the greatest state enterprise or the greatest social problem and say, okay, we know here's a problem. We do have a document to prove that. We will resolve something. And in these cases, definitely sometimes you just pick up the wrong solution because you didn't dig dive into the root causes and trying to understand what is the real problem. And sometimes like implementing technology is a great answer on, what are you going to do with this issue from the citizens? Okay, we will implement an IT services. Will it help or not? We don't know. No one will measure the effect at the end of the day. We just will, spend the money on some kind of a project. So yeah, and here's a great issue on how the technology should be used over here, definitely, because there's the great risk on just like implementing the technology, because everything is great with artificial intelligence, for example.
Dima, I think there is one thing that we have to discuss in this episode because I won't be able to sleep. Could you tell me about this IBM example that you put in the notes? I'm really curious because I know that you and Vasya have discussed something right in the doc, and then Vasya resolved the thing. So I don't know what it was. I'm really curious.
Oh, I think, let me try to unwrap this. I think, as we already discussed, that there are multiple differences between like regular quote unquote commercial enterprises and state-owned enterprises. And I think one of the difference there is also that with commercial enterprise, there is at least a possibility of somewhat unlimited or very high kind of upside, right? You can create a very successful commercial thing and you can earn a lot of money or like a lot of respect and a lot of stuff. Like basically there is an opportunity, like the higher limit of what you can get is, at least in theory, can be unlimited. The uptake can be unlimited. Whereas with state-owned enterprises, I think that's not the case. Like the upper bound of what you can get as an individual working there is it has its natural limits, because the state-owned enterprise, they spend like public money, and there is limit on public public spending, at least from that point of view. And at the same time, the scrutiny for state-owned enterprises is a lot higher, right? You like when you spend as a state-owned enterprise, if you spend money on something, there is a lot more scrutiny for like where the money goes. And if commercial enterprise can like, oh, let's try Jira, next year let's try something else, and then the next year let's try something else, it can be that in this situation all of those three managers who drive those innovations can get bonuses for driving innovations. But in the state-owned enterprise, it can be seen as like you're just wasting public money. And the IBM example comes here. There is this saying that it's old, right? It's not longer relevant in 21st century. I think like there was a saying that no one ever got fired for buying IBM. It's just saying to indicate that people playing it safe, buying from already established vendors and buying very standard non-innovative solutions, like you cannot get fired for that. But you may get fired if you want to try something new, something like weird at that moment. And if it does not work out, you will probably get fired. But you will probably not get fired if you buy the same old boring solution that is kind of proven. That's the IBM story.
So in the modern world, you will just substitute it to Microsoft, right?
Yeah, more or less. Maybe. Yeah, it was like in 80s, 90s days sane, I think. 1980s, 1990s.
Well, basically, from my perspective, I wouldn't agree in 100% that it's the major differences between the government and the commercial sector. It's more about like more or less about the risk appetites and like something like that. So I mean, probably that's okay to try different type of innovation in the software development. But I think we would not like be happy if, for example, like the medical services will experiment in such way, like let's try this medicine. Oh no, then let's try this one. Or for example, like airplane production. So something like that, or electricity production. So I mean, From my perspective, it's more about the level of risk which might lead to this experiment. On the other hand, definitely the valid part of this point is that spending are much more controlled on the government level. Sometimes it's definitely a problem. So you cannot just, spend the money like a venture investment or something like that. But again, it's more in this case. I think it's more about on which type of services should be on the government level. And if we will go back to this article which Slav mentioned today, so I think that the major part of the government service, they should not have this venture investment on their side, on the government side. So probably this part can be transferred to the private sector, and then government just can use some of really trusted solution. Because if government would not, then we may come up with an example of, there's no place, there's no value for cybersecurity, like let's experiment on the government level, and so on. So probably, there would be a lag with the implementation of some modern technology on the government level, but I don't think it's really because of government and commercial. It's more about risky part of the business.
I think it kind of brings me to one of the risks that I wanted to mention here, is that government-owned solutions are quite often impacted or influenced by people who don't fully understand how it works. There are people who are decision makers, who approve the budgets or who build the policies, who sometimes don't fully understand the nature of something. Back to the example with DIA and cybersecurity, like people who advocate for DIA or provide more services there, they don't always fully understand to what extent they risk the personal data and many more other risk factors that are included into this single app or their database as it is. So when I think of a commercial business, they're also quite often impacted by people who don't understand. In my case, it's our discussion that Dima and I had about IPO. Like whenever the company goes public, then their stock evaluation gets dependent on tweets of the founder and investors' opinion on something and some articles in New York Times about their management practices and something, and that can actually harm or benefit the business in very unpredictable way. And I think that to the same extent, state-owned services are also impacted by, but not by public opinion, but some authorities' opinion. I'm not sure whether I'm right because I've never managed a state-owned.
I would say dependent on the public opinion as well. There are two types of thoughts over here. First is about skin in the game. Yes, so when you are working for a commercial company, your salary, your income will depend on your effectiveness. That's not really often the case in case of governmental service. And that might be some kind of vulnerability for taking wrong decision. But on the other hand, it's also a preserver here by the public opinion. So a lot of people who take a decision on the governmental level, they see themselves as civil servants, and they build the career of civil servants, and that means that any type of political opinion might lead to the demolishing of their career. That's why probably even more they dependent on the media and on the public opinion. And the risk probably here is that no one would like to take a solution which might lead to a lot of wrong tweets, because it might ruin your career. And again, from my perspective, it might be even more significant factor in terms of taking the risky decision on the state-owned enterprise level. So, I mean, for example, almost no one in Ukraine buys software development services as a time and material contract, rather as a fixed price only, because it's a bit safer and it's less risk that you got some kind of scandal about that type. On another hand, definitely for some type of development, time and material is much more effective. So the ProZorro did it. There is no limitation on the legal part of the job. So you can definitely buy the time and material. You can sign time and material contract. It wouldn't lead to, bigger efforts. It will give you more controls on the development, but no one would like to risk because that might impact your career. And that definitely somehow limits the effectiveness of the government enterprise. So probably it's another part of the game, is that on the government level, you always somehow in the politics, whether you are real politics or not. So definitely they're the big part of the job. Well, fortunately, I didn't have a political ambition. Sometimes we can do a bit different stuff in the ProZorro, but in most cases, yeah, that would be a limitation.
Yeah, Vasya, but still listening to you, I can say that you can take a person out of public service to commercial business, but you can't take public service out of the mind of the person who worked there.
Yeah, but that basically because working for the government, it's a great experience to understand another area of your life. It's like imagine people who didn't hear anything about the sport activities or some kind of that stuff, and then one of the sudden he started to do sports and he discovered the whole world behind it. So you have to do something about your health. You can find a lot of people and a lot of new emotions over here. That's basically about the government. So someone from, I guess, 18th century in France said that if you would not be engaged into the politics, then the politics would just control you and be engaged in your life in turn. So it's another part of our life, and I'm pretty sure everyone should, spend some time not to the politics, but to the community building. Basically, all the politics is about how to establish the good community we are living in.
Vasya, can I rephrase the question just to check whether I understood you correctly? So, as a person who has successfully or temporarily retired from public service, would you recommend, hopefully successfully, but possibly temporarily, would you suggest that people who listen to our show and they are, let's say, managerial software related guys, consider getting at certain stage of their career an opportunity in public sector just to see whether this experience can impact them successfully, or maybe just
absolutely. You're totally right. That would be my recommendation. Probably not for 6 years. So I'm not sure that was the great experience, and probably not to the big state-owned enterprise or big reform. But in Ukraine, there are a bunch of initiatives, even now, on either connected to military, connected to humanitarian area, hopefully in the nearest future connected to the Ukraine's rebuild. And I would suggest not to see this experience as the involving in the politics, but rather as an involvement into the life of your community. So any type of involvement which not only connected with the earning money, but with the establishing better community you're living in, either small community or greater one, is really great experience in terms basically of substituting this old-fashioned USSR government with a new modern way to govern the country. And so, and again, for those who works in the software development area, it's absolutely the great way to do it, because in most cases you just can then retire and find a place in the commercial sector. It's much more difficult for guys from another areas, for legal person for like career civil servants. But if you are an IT guy, so definitely that would be my recommendation to take this experience. It's just another area of life.
Cool. And Vasya, thank you for opening up this for me, because you were basically my keyhole to look into this weird world. It turned out that you and I met previously when I was working on an educational project with ProZorro many years ago, but we didn't actually connect that much. And right now, after having a few conversations, I can definitely recommend to my friends and people to look into this direction as well, because the way you changed and the way people in this industry changed their attitude towards understanding what's fair, understanding what's justice, understanding what's efficiency is very different that you can get from any business. Or like you can change multiple companies in commercial sector and not get these questions that you ask yourself and people around you. And I really appreciate that you do, even after coming back to product lead position.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's...
I believe we could call it a day, and we could call it a good day, because I think the conversation was useful. We will publish it in a few days, and all our listeners will have a chance to hear us in about 2 weeks.
In about a week. Yeah, but it was great conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for having me.